So my mom passed away in December of 2024. And before that, she had been on hospice for about a month and a half. And before that, palliative care for about 6 months. And during that journey, as she continued to decline with restrictive lung disease, causing periods of some confusion, causing periods of time where she was in and out of the hospital because she would have an episode with her lungs. And, she would go into the hospital, and for every day that you spend in the hospital, the rule is you need a week of rehab to get back to where you were because you kind of laid in a bed. So she would do that. She would, God love her, she would have an episode. She'd go to the ER, she'd go to the hospital, and then she'd have, this rehab. And every time she was able to get back to the personal care home that she lived at, the place that at that point in time she had lived for 8 years and was her home. And that was always her goal. But every time there was a concern that she wouldn't be able to quite get back. And sometimes when she would get back, we'd have to add more care for her to even stay in that care environment. And so in this time of crisis and dealing with, her decline and the reality of that, we were lucky enough to find time to kind of talk about what life is good living for her. And where did she want this to go? Did she want to continue this really horrific experience? And just so you know, for many years, the answer to that was yes. For many years, I can remember, she also had drop foot, which really kind of gave this whole other element to her mobility, increased the amount of times that she fell. And there was times that she fell and, her head was bleeding and she was in an ambulance going to the hospital. And those whole experiences were just so, so hard. And as a caregiver, I'm walking the journey with her. I'm trying to be there for her, but at the same time, watching the woman that I love just, continue to fight as hard as she could. But for me, so now I'm an elder law attorney. I should know the answers to these questions. I tell families every day, you need to talk about this. You need to make decisions. But boy, when you're in the middle of it, it's hard. But for me, it was when we got palliative care. So palliative care is care that's about, let's treat the symptoms. Let's not try necessarily to cure all of this, but let's treat the symptoms. And let's really talk about the journey and what's ahead. And in that time, we talked about, would she want to be resuscitated? And we talked about the reality of resuscitation of, she had surgery on her neck and the reality of, the compressions and her maybe breaking ribs. And would she want that? And, we started with that, and it took a period of 6 months to really have conversations. This is not about going into somebody and saying, okay, do you want resuscitated or not? This is about really kind of talking about the care that you would want, the interventions that you would want, and kind of picking those through. And we were really lucky that the palliative care certified registered nurse practitioner, Jody, was able to have those conversations with her over a series of time to the point that we got to, which was she didn't want to do it anymore. She didn't want to. She didn't want to do that whole hospital thing. Now, please know, she'd actually gotten better. We had less hospital visits. Palliative care had worked. And but she got to a point, too, where she had some sciatica problems. She was in a lot of pain, and she didn't want to do it. And we as a family were able to come together and talk about that. And we had a plan. She had decided, let's not call the hospital. Let's not call the ambulance again. Let's not go through this again. Let's keep her as good as we can and as comfortable as we can. Try not to have an episode. But if it happened, let's not. And, at the end of my mom's life, when it happened, even with clarity on what she wanted, communication amongst the family, it was still hard. I'll never forget my brother calling me and saying, Mom wasn't, I live right across the street from her, but of course this happened when I was about 2 hours away. So my brother calls and he's like, Mom's not doing good. I'm going to call the ambulance. And I said, Buddy, no, Mom doesn't want that. And Buddy knew that, but please know this episode is about the fact that all of this is hard. We'd have to have a plan. But then when we go to fill it carried out, like when I said to my brother, no, he understood, but you see, that's just the natural reaction. Natural reaction is to call and get help because this is what we do for a living. But the problem is once you make that call and we're in the ambulance and we're on our way to the hospital, we've set into motion things that we may not be able to stop or easily stop. And so, she had made that decision. And so we didn't. Now, my brother's a fixer. So he did go find an oxygen machine and fixed it up. Now he does nothing with healthcare, but he can probably make anything work. Yeah, Uncle Buddy can probably make anything fix and work. And that was his way of helping. And that oxygen did make her more comfortable. And after this, my mom lived about a week and a half. And we had to hospice. And it was hard. But today we're sharing this with you because we're going to talk about care decisions. And we're going to talk about that very specifically with dementia and how we can do that. And so I'm Julie, and I'm here with my daughter, Cortney. And this is our Hey, What a Minute podcast, which is dedicated to my mom. And it's designed to tell stories and caregive and hopefully be there for you if you're a caregiver, as a phone call that we miss having with my mom, Nana, and to talk about real things that can be helpful. And today we're joined by a special guest.
Yeah, so, before we introduce the special guest, I do want to give a shout out to our out-of-town kids and grandkids because I wasn't always there during the conversations that we had, but I knew intellectually what they were and what Nan wanted. And so I was actually home that night. And so my sister, I was supposed to spend the night with Nan that night, but I had something to finish for work. And so my sister was like, well, I'll go visit. And then you come over. And when you come over, I'll come back to the house because we lived right across the street. And I was like, oh, okay, that sounds good. I'll clean up from dinner. You go over. I'll never forget Steph picking up the phone and calling me and saying we have to call the ambulance and the nurse won't call. And I knew why the nurse wouldn't call. And so I walked over. Uncle Buddy's rooting through the garage looking for the oxygen thing and some sort of tape and whatever he was looking for was, but he was off doing that. And I walked into the room and my sister is looking at me and I looked at the nurse and I said, I need to see the form. And she was like, well, you know what it says. I was like, I need to see it. Mm-hmm. And I walked back into the nursing station and I saw the form and I saw that she had signed it. And I knew I was going to do one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, which is walk back into a room full of people that have looked up to me their whole life. And I was about to tell them that this was it. Mm-hmm. And intellectually understanding what that means 4 months before you have to use that document is very different than standing there. And as a grown-ass adult whose mom was 2 hours away, who I looked at the nurse and I said, I'm going to stand in the break room. I'm going to cry for 2 minutes and then I am going to be fine for 2 hours until my mom gets here. And I remember her being like, you're going to what? And I was like, just watch. This is what's going to happen. And I did. And then you got there and I was like, okay, I don't have to be an adult anymore. But, these conversations are so impactful because you have to have them early because I knew that I needed to see the form. I knew what it said. I knew what she wanted. But it helps in that moment because it's not the first time you're seeing it. And so, we're really excited today to be joined with Eloy, who
Hi.
flew to Phoenix for the recording of this all the way from Amsterdam.
Yes, of course.
And
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, so we're so excited. And he joins us to bring his own experiences. And so we'd love for you to share with our listeners a little bit about who you are and the experience that brings you here today.
Okay, thank you, Courtney and Julie. So I'm known maybe a little bit worldwide because I'm one of the founders of the Hogewijk, the first dementia village in the world. But I'm also a caregiver for my mom, even the first responsible medical caregiver in the Netherlands. And my mom is living with dementia as well, alone in her house where she lives already for 58 years.
Wow.
My age. It's a little secret. Yeah. And I have two brothers and one sister. And we also discussed already, luckily, with my mom 5 years ago, what she wanted if she was developing dementia, or maybe if she needed skilled nursing care, or what if she cannot decide anymore. So luckily, we arranged a lot on time, the financial side, who is responsible, but also the medical side, and who is responsible, who to ask if something happens, or if my mom cannot make her own decisions anymore in certain situations. Yeah.
And I think
Interesting.
I think for many people, we talk about the form. So I just want to, as the attorney here, I have to talk about the form because papers.
The form.
Yeah.
I'm Dutch. I'm from the Netherlands, by the way. Did I mention that? Oh, yeah, Amsterdam. The form. What does it say?
Yeah. So many people think, okay, what we need to do is go to an elder law attorney or an estate planning attorney and get a living will, advance directive. And that is true. So those are documents that say, here's who's going to make the decision for me. It's really, really important. As an elder law attorney, the number one thing I need to know when somebody's in a crisis and can no longer tell me is, who do you want me to listen to? Who's your decision maker? That's so, so important because often families aren't on the same page and I don't really know who has that person's voice. So the documents are helpful to establish the who. In some jurisdictions, so in the U.S., depending on what state you live in, they can be really, really important. So I live in a state in Pennsylvania that's clear and convincing evidence. So in order for us to decide that we're going to pull the plug or not intervene, we have to know for sure, clear and convincingly, that the person that's in the bed would have wanted that. Now, there's other states like Florida that it's substituted judgment. So we say to the judge, here's the situation, please substitute your judgment. Like a reasonable person would want this.
You have to go to the judge in such a crisis situation?
There's certainly, not every case goes to the judge, Eloy, but when families fight, there certainly are cases that have went up in our courts that have looked at these issues. Yeah, it's a little crazy. And really, the point of this conversation that we're having today is to make sure that doesn't happen. Because the forms, as an attorney, I always think the legal documents are important. But I would have to say in this circumstance, the conversation's more important. And so, Courtney, the form that she was looking at was called a POLST or a MOLST, depending on the state you're in. A POLST is a physician's ordered life-sustaining treatment. And a MOLST is a medical order of life-sustaining treatment. So many states have legislation about them. The difference between that and the living will I was talking about is that this is a physician's order. So that was a pink form that was in the chart that my mom had made those decisions about, and a doctor had ordered it. So a doctor had ordered, she's not to go out. She's on hospice at this point in time. This is a decision she's made. And we're not just looking at a form and asking somebody, we're actually following a doctor's order, which is really, really helpful. But, what we really want to get into today is, the idea of like, how did we get there? How did we get there as far as making those decisions? How did we help my mom make those decisions? How did we as a family communicate them? And please know, I don't think we did it perfectly. But I also spent a lot of time with families who are arguing and fighting. And I think sometimes it's just this lack of communication. And, Eloy, with you here, I also want to add, kind of your whole paradigm and perspective that you bring, which is, it's okay to kind of make this decision that we don't have to save life at all costs. I think, in the U.S., that's kind of our default. And I think...
True.
Yeah.
That's also the interesting thing, because I'm Dutch, you are American.
Yeah.
And I meet a lot of Americans in my work, but
who are all lovely, right?
Yes, because they
Well,
are
at least
mostly social interest, and so it's, yes, absolutely. All people I meet, because they care for people, they are more human. The more human versions. Not all people are very human focused, but okay, that's another discussion. No. So, but there is really a different mindset in the United States, if we generalize, compared to, for example, the Netherlands. In what is a good intervention, still a treatment? And I was listening to you, the story about your mom. So that was very interesting and moving. And still, in the Netherlands, it would work out differently, because in the Netherlands, also in hospitals and nursing homes, if you talk with the professionals, because not all people living in the Netherlands are aware about this, that we intervene less than you do in the United States. The medical clinical model is much more in place in the United States, trying to intervene, because so much is possible nowadays. And I was impressed by the discussion you had in the family, these interventions. What's the effect of that intervention on normal daily life? And I think we have a little bit different view on that in the Netherlands if we zoom out. But there are also the same opinions like in the United States, of course. And we cannot in one way generalize too much. But what you do in a Dutch hospital, which is paid out of our social security system, by the way, so it's not private pay, all those interventions, it's still balanced, the quality of life and the intervention you get. So that's interesting to discuss. But we must keep in mind that we are living in different countries with a different mindset constantly.
Yeah. And I think, again, that makes it even more important here in the U.S. to have these conversations so that we don't do interventions that aren't necessary or that the person really didn't want. I think, that's out of everything I've always obviously grappled with all kinds of, wishes that I wish I had done better when my mom was sick, and regrets. And, I think that's, part of the natural grief process. But the one thing we got right was she didn't go back to the hospital. And she did die at that point in time, she considered her home, because she had lived there for 8 years. And that's the success in all of this, is that she didn't get rushed off to the hospital and then died in a hospital bed.
And in the end, you started to talk about dying and how do you want to die? And that's what also we in the Netherlands don't do enough. And that's what we don't do enough in the world. We think with all the technology and all the good clinical interventions that we live forever. And many people don't talk about end of life. They don't want to, they cannot. So if I stop talking about the Hogewijk and dementia villages and dementia care, I am going to talk about death and dying. Because that makes that if you start that conversation and you realize that, we can also talk about how do you want to die? And what do you want to do in your last phase of life? Do you want to be in that hospital because you want to live forever? It's a choice.
It is.
Or do you want to enjoy your grandchildren, music, a walk, and you know you will pass away due to the medical problems you have.
When I feel like it's also one of those things that changes across the lifespan. So in the U.S., at least in Pennsylvania, a lot of the documents talk about a living will. So a document that says, I don't want to be artificially kept alive, talks about a realistic hope of significant recovery. So as an attorney,
what's that?
I know. What does that mean? What does that mean? Like, it means something different for different people. And it can mean something different at different stages in our life. Like, so for me, I can use my husband and I. So I make my living by talking. I don't physically have to be able to do anything. It's my mind and talking. My husband makes his living very physically, demolition, excavating. So a realistic hope of significant recovery have always meant different things to us. He would need to be him. I wouldn't. Like, I would say to him, listen, if I'm in a car accident and something happens and I haven't raised these kids yet, don't stop intervening because I'm coming back. I'm raising these kids. Like, I'm telling you, like, don't give up on me, right? Now my kids are raised and I feel a little different, I mean, I still hope he like tries a little, but but add a diagnosis of dementia onto something like that. Do we stop and talk about how that changes, what interventions we'd want? Because realistic hope of significant recovery has to mean something different, right?
Yeah, true. And often I think it's also a lack about knowledge. What's the benefit, or what's the impact of the intervention, the surgery, and also what will happen when you're living with dementia, and how does it progress? And so how to balance those interventions. And if I talk about my mom, we now see, and we discussed intensively, the children, with my mom when she was still able to do 4 or 5 years ago, that dementia is now her biggest problem. And the way she lives with it, and also with her identity, and what she can still do and cannot due to her identity, who she is, and the way she wants to stay in control, and she feels that she's losing control, that's her biggest problem. So also we said we don't do any other health interventions anymore because it's a good way to pass. That's her path, because dementia will progress and she will not be happy anymore. The question is she happy at this moment? A few times per week.
And I think too, Mom, something that you said that I think is important is this isn't a one-time conversation. Like, this is a conversation that has to be had numerous times throughout the diagnosis as things change. I think about with Nan, I've talked about it a little bit before, but for those of you that don't know, a couple years ago, she had a surgery where she actually had a bone that was protruding into her spine, and it would have paralyzed her. And so she had a surgery where they put a cage around it. And basically, her cardiologist cleared her for this surgery, not because they thought that physically she could handle it, but because she didn't have a choice.
Right. And
I remember driving home. So for those of you that are from the northeast of the U.S., that stretch of 84 through Connecticut has seen me cry quite often. And I remember driving home and thinking about like the doctors literally said to her, you may not make it off of this table. And so I drove home, and I spent the day, she checked into the hospital the day before, and I spent that day, I sat with her most of the day. I just took my laptop and she watched the news, and I worked, and we chit-chatted, and I got up to leave, and she looked at me and she was like, I'm going to do this. And if there was a woman that could will herself out of a surgery, it was this woman. And I said, woman, I said, yes, you can. I said, you can do this. And she called me that morning before she went into surgery. It was COVID, so there was like some weird rules about, people being in the hospital. They had kind of given us a little bit of leeway the day before anyway, because of, the doctors they were realistic about her chances.
Well, to be honest, as an attorney, I snuck some people in.
Yes. So my mom came in with forms. My brother shows up in as the witness for these documents in camouflage Crocs, a cut off Rippin' Lips t-shirt.
It's a
and
Your
fishing
mom?
thing.
and no, my brother was
Oh.
wearing this as
He was
the official witness for these documents. But
So I was able to get some of the grandkids in to see her even during COVID in the hospital because I was like, I'm an attorney and I have documents for her to sign. And we did sign documents.
We
I did
did.
not lie, would
Nope.
not do that. But anyway, so
not the
sorry.
most professional looking witnesses is what I would say. But, at that point, there were grandkids that still had not graduated from high school. And for her, she was going to watch all of them do that. I walked out of that hospital and I said, woman, like, you are going to do this. And she said, I am. And so those end of life conversations at that point in time, even though we were really talking about a surgery she would not make it out of, it was a very different conversation because she still had fight in her. She still very much wanted to live. Very much understood like what that would mean. So she couldn't turn her neck from side to side at all. If she had to move her whole body. So it was a major change. But from that conversation to a couple years later, after she had fought for so long, and that's why it's important to start these conversations early because they change and they take a while it's a different thing to emotionally accept what's happening as the caregiver and as the person who's making the decisions versus intellectually understanding what's happening.
Well, and at that same time, I'm driving her to the hospital and I realized that like, I didn't know. So when I was a kid, my mom played the piano at church. And I thought, goodness, I don't know what song she'd want at her funeral.
Great time to ask.
No, please
Great
no.
time to
I'm not
ask.
saying that this was the best, but I thought to myself, I'm driving, she's sitting beside me, and I'm thinking to myself, I cannot ask, something goes wrong and she'll haunt me the rest of my life, or I can ask and then I know. And so I asked. And it was really interesting. She came back at me with the same thing that you did, which was, I will see DJ and Lexi graduate from high school. Like, I will be there. Like, that was, she had just decided. Like
She
you said,
didn't answer the question, what kind of music?
oh no, she did. She begrudgingly did tell me that. And I did write it down. Eloy, don't worry. But I think, that's me not being ready for all of it. And, in a few years and really taking her lead, which was like, don't even talk about it, because I'm just going to be there. And I know what they're saying, but that's not what's going to happen. And that's what she believed. And that's what happened. I remember calling the grandchildren, telling them all, you have to keep going to school. She needs more graduations because this is like, an important thing. One of the things I will give a shout out for anybody that's listening, I think there's a great nonprofit out of Boston called the Conversation Project, and you can just Google that, the Conversation Project. I sit here as an attorney, but I've personally used that. I used that when my father-in-law had dementia, and he interestingly still wanted to live with the dementia. Like that was what he wanted. I didn't use it with my mom, but we've used it at our office and given it to families because what it does is it really does a great job in laying out like, where do you have the conversation? Who should be there? And then obviously the conversation itself, because I'm sure many listeners are thinking, well, how would you ever do this? Yeah.
And many don't dare to do it or they cannot do it. And that's why it's important to have this topic, because I think most people will benefit from having the conversation up front. And you're right. So I talk about my mom, and I think, and we agree that she will pass away with dementia because it's getting worse, but other people can live with dementia very happily and comfortable. And so it's a choice. And you have to evaluate constantly these conversations.
Yeah. I definitely think, if you're listening, the message of this podcast episode is try to have the conversation and start with talking to your loved one about what living is good living. And I know that some of that, the reason we don't do it is we have to acknowledge where we're at. So we have to acknowledge that we have dementia or that we have some diagnosis that has this downward decline, and where are we going? And we might be like my father-in-law that says, but I still enjoy life, 14 years, and he enjoyed life to the very end. So we have to take away our own biases and allow that person to talk. And then, there'll be somebody in the family that has to also communicate that with others so that everybody can start to accept where we're going and get on the same page, because as an elder law attorney, I deal with families all the time who are in crisis, that the first time they talk about this is, the ICU waiting room. Not a great time. People are on different pages, and then we have arguments amongst families. Some families aren't able to really have conflict and talk through things. And so an already hard situation becomes harder. And I would say the real issue with that for me is, it's sad to see families that suffer wounds and fractures that kind of will never be repaired. Because usually everybody wants something good for it. So Eloy, we look to you really as an expert in the field of dementia and care. What would you say to, whether the person that's a caregiver out there, what would you say to them if they're kind of just listening to this and grappling with what's their next step or their next move?
That's a difficult question because it depends on your individual situation. I would always say talk. We mentioned. Also, if that's difficult, also in the United States, there are now some Alzheimer cafes.
Yes.
Meetings where you can meet with other people who are sort of in the same situation. It's also a Dutch initiative, by the way, the Alzheimer Cafe. I'm not sure if you knew. No, not of course. But
I do love the Alzheimer's cafes. They're fantastic. Yeah.
So where there's a topic discussed and you can meet other people and share experiences. In my work and also in my private situation, it's always important to realize that we talk about human beings. So try to see the person behind the disease. Realize that that person can change due to the disease. So the grief maybe already starts while you're still living together. But try to discuss that with the person itself, of course, but also with others, and realize it's about a normal human life, and how can you make that the best in the last phase.
I think that's a really interesting point because, so one, if the person is cognitively able to be a part of that conversation, that's what you want because you want to know for sure what they want. But if you've had the conversation before and now you're getting to the point where maybe cognitively you're not sure how much they understand, I think about Nan's final days, and the one thing that really bothered me was when somebody would come in, a healthcare professional, and they would talk about her like she's not there. And we really don't know how much like she understood in those final days. And so really, if you're going to have a conversation about the person, don't do it over the bed.
Or the chair or in front. Absolutely not.
Like go into a separate room or something like that, especially if you're trying to grapple with your own feelings, which are so valid through this process, because sometimes it can happen very quickly. And so, grapple with them outside in the nurse's break room. Lots of times they have conference rooms, or if you're in a house, do it in a separate room. But never talk over the person like they're not there, because you really don't know what they understand and don't understand in those final moments. And we want to be ultimately respectful of that person and what they're going through.
Very important remark. Yeah.
I also think, I want to delve a little bit into some interventions, and particularly as it relates to dementia. And just some changes that have been happening, kind of across the U.S. With, particularly eating. And so, thinking about, exactly what Cortney's talking about, which is, having that conversation with the person when they're able to enter that conversation. So many times today, we have that living will, which is a document that says, kind of no realistic hope of significant recovery. And then we add to it maybe a dementia care directive that says, okay, when I have dementia, this is what I want. And we talk about like, when am I incapacitated? That, as an attorney, that's such a hard question. So we have thoughts about like, when does that happen? When do I not want to do things anymore? So for some, it could be something like, I don't recognize my family members. So as an attorney, I'm trying to give tools to people that are maybe more objective, like I don't want to say like the 3rd stage of dementia or the 6th stage or, whatever, because to me that there's no objectivity
I
there.
never talk about stages. No.
Yeah,
No.
me neither.
Or the measure methods where you are. No.
Yeah.
That's the clinical, medical view again, instead of the holistic view, because so much more.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that, because I feel the same way. I feel like, and please know I was a social
And you are
worker.
a lawyer. You are.
I know, but I was a social worker first, and I had to be like the person that like put people in those stages, and then I had to like tell the families, like defend the stage that they were in, and it's But I think right now, one of the things we think about, like New York State just has a new law about voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. So the idea is I get a diagnosis of dementia. I fill out a form that says, listen, when I no longer can recognize my family members, I want to voluntarily stop and eat. And there's a part of me that thinks that's great because it's objective. It's, we do a lot of force feeding. I mean, when I was in a nursing home as a social worker in the 1990s, I can remember people being hooked up to tube feeding, and like thinking this person's bedridden, like, why are we doing this? But like nobody could have the conversation about not doing it. Nobody wanted to like say,
So we don't do that in the Hoogeweg. That's now general knowledge that especially elder care physicians we have in the Netherlands in nursing homes agree that you don't force people to eat if they are not able anymore. Of course, if it's another problem, a dental problem, we can fix that. But people refuse food because the body is shutting down. That's what we learned over the last 10, 15 years. So it's almost it is inhumane to feed a dying body. But it has to do with the conversation we had, accepting that people pass away or can die. So that's one of the approaches we don't do in the Hoogeweg, although it's highly complex care. No IVs, no feeding tubes, no Paxons, no feeding intervention. And so, but you were talking about your own choice to die and stop eating and then die.
And and I first of all, my hat's off to New York State and some of the practitioners there with their forward thinking. So I first want to say that because I think we have to have more forward thinking about this. But I do grapple with that because I think, what self are we talking about? The self that signed the form or the self that now is in that stage? And what if they want to eat? Like, what do we do then? Like, there's one thing of what you're saying, which is the person doesn't want to eat anymore. We don't want to like force them and, make it our, now they have a, and it's hard in the US that they have a weight loss. So now we have to do an intervention to stop the weight loss. Well, we certainly, that's just a natural part of this. So we don't want to do that. But what do we do if somebody does still want to eat? And are we okay with signing a form that later on that self that's there, isn't following the form, if you will. And I think that's hard, but I think there are conversations that we have to have with our primary care doctors, with our specialists before working with a neurologist, and get educated and have conversations with families. And of course, talk to our loved one about what it is that they would want.
But that's very technically, it's what I read. It's very difficult. If you say, I stop eating, there will be a phase where your body, your mind asks for food again. But in the Netherlands, I know that's your own right to stop eating. And if you are getting worse, in the end, the GP, the doctor, has to support you with pain medication, comfortable medication that makes you comfortable. Even when I was... after my mother had an intervention in hospital, and I went to the doctor with her to talk about this, and next time we don't want this anymore, he also said, your mother can also just stop eating. That's also a choice if she wants. So that was part of the whole conversation. And in the end, the doctor must support my mom again with being comfortable. My mom doesn't make that choice, although she's losing a lot of weight. But we make sure she has enough food in the fridge and we support her and so. But she's also losing a lot of weight. So I don't know where this will end. She's not literally stopping, but she eats less and less. It's also a natural process. So when you're living with dementia, your taste changes, the way you want to eat changes. But if you offer the food, and now my mom losing a lot of weight, in the end, it will cause a crisis probably.
And I think what we're talking about for everybody is that crisis is happening for everybody that we caregive for. And the question is, are we ready for that crisis?
And do we talk about this? And because other people would say, no, this is not good. I have I must care for my mom in a good way. And so we agree on this, and we are very open to everybody who supports my mom, the professionals and the family and their friends. And you must stay within the law, also in the Netherlands. Some people think not, but yes. But you have to talk about it. And other people would make another decision. That's also fine. But there are many ways. And you don't have to sign a form, as far as I know, in the Netherlands. So in that way, you're more formal, I think, here in the United States in these kind of topics.
Yeah.
And I think, for anybody listening who maybe is a little bit overwhelmed about doing this, about having these conversations.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It's normal. It is an overwhelming thought process. It's an extra layer on caregiving. But I encourage you to go to the planningandprotecting.com website and find an attorney that's willing to sit and have these conversations, to get the documents, even if they're not perfect. It's a step in the right direction, and it can open up the conversation to be had with the person that you're caregiving for. The attorneys that are on that site have social workers on staff that can help you navigate this, that can maybe referee a family conversation a little bit. If you don't have somebody in your family that's willing to kind of take the lead and have this conversation, you might, have it, bringing in a third party may make it feel a little less intimidating to have the conversation, because it's not you that's bringing it forward. It's a professional. And I think that's really great. So we just ask the listeners, go to planningandprotecting.com. If you need resources, follow us along on TikTok, on Instagram, on Facebook for any of the resources. And just know that this is hard and that's okay. And taking one small step forward is really helpful. And so, Eloy, we thank you for joining another episode to have really a heavy conversation, but a great conversation, and something that we really set out to do, my mom and I, when we started this podcast, was shed light to conversations that people don't necessarily want to have, but are so necessary. And so we thank the listeners for sticking with us. And, we hope you come back and listen again to another, maybe not so heavy conversations. We try to sprinkle, the light and the heavy all together.